and that was Mahazain with Palestine Will Be Free. Now, as I mentioned before, many protests have been taking place up and down Britain in support of the Palestinian people who are suffering from the brutality of Israeli authorities who are breaking international law with their apartheid regime and human rights abuses aimed at Palestinians in Gaza. Here to tell us more about the protest in London at the weekend is criminal lawyer Tasneem Akunji. Assalamu alaikum, Tasneem.
Welcome.
Now, Tasneem, you were at the protest this Saturday in London in support of Palestine. Why did you decide to go and join?
Well, there's a number of reasons and a little bit of thinking behind it, but predominantly it's because we all saw on TV screens and actually more over social media the attack on the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the attack on the Palestinians by the Israelis was entirely unprovoked. And what we saw was that media wasn't reporting it in that way, not accurately and not fairly at all. The narrative that was being pushed out was that apparently Israel was responding to Hamas, but that was certainly not the case. And as we looked on our TV screens, we saw ever greater aggression unfolding, leading to the murder of children, the collapsing of buildings by the Israeli forces. And Palestinians really very badly suffering. And even though we have a government here, a Home Secretary who, quite illegally promised to pay the Israeli IDF UK Development Fund money and was sacked for that, and we have Boris Johnson, who's always been a stalwart of Israel, I didn't expect that anything that a protest would do would change their minds. But one thing I was really mindful of was that if there are Palestinians suffering and they manage to look at their TV screens, they will see solidarity in the millions around the world of people who care for what's happening to them and want to protest what's happening to them. And by that small measure, that we could give them some succor, some relief, at least to show them that people want to share their burden.
I mean, I absolutely agree. Like you said, a lot of people say, well, what can we do? What can a protest do? Well, like you said, at the very least, it gives support. It shows those in Palestine that we are united with them. That we are saying, no, there should not be oppressed. There should not be apartheid. The brutality from the Israeli authorities has to stop now. And, that means a lot. And it can also strengthen those who feel that they're in a position of not being able to do anything, in a position of helplessness. And I guess that's why those protests weren't just in London; they were up and down the country. This is growing, Tasneem, isn't it?
Well, it's not, I wouldn't say it's just up and down the country. It's been around the world, in the US and in France. In France, we saw that some of the protests in Paris were suppressed by water cannons. And so it also shows something else. It shows the populations in different countries around the world that the population are different from their government. Our populations, like we have in long ago with the war in Iraq, we marched in the millions to say that this is not in our name. We are apparently represented by democratic governments, and we very, very strongly, as a people, were against what our governments were doing. But our governments carried on regardless. And that tells us something about the state we're in that our governments aren't representing the will of the people. We're representing the will of a very small lobby group, even within Israel, which is a government of Netanyahu that is on the edge of failure. They've had 3 elections themselves because the Israeli people themselves aren't fully behind the actions and the behavior of the ultra-right wing in Israel. And so it serves many more purposes than just telling the Palestinians that we support them. It tells Netanyahu that the world is against him. It gives support to those in Israel who are against Netanyahu's policies and against the oppression of the Palestinians, Israelis themselves, that they have international support in the millions behind them as well. And it tells our government that we see you. We see what you've done, and we see you don't represent our will.
That's actually very interesting what you said about that there are actually people in Israel that are not behind Netanyahu, and he hasn't got the support. You feel he hasn't got the support which he's actually claiming.
Well, 3 elections in a year suggest he doesn't have the support that he's claiming. It is my view that this current round of hostility, aggression and war criminality was launched by Netanyahu to try and shift his domestic politics to the right, so that it gives him greater ability to hold on to power. So, unfortunately, the Palestinians are paying the price in blood for Netanyahu's greed to hold on to power domestically within his so-called democratic context.
And even at the protest itself, I mean, we've seen pictures on social media. There were actually quite a few people from the Jewish community there at the protests. And this is not, I mean, people are making out as if it's a religious issue, a religious war, but it's not, because, you know, the Jewish community are actually supporting the Muslim community in saying that, you know, this has to stop in Israel, that there shouldn't be this bloodshed against the Palestinians. It's not from Judaism, is it?
No, I mean, look, any religion at all, you know, particularly the Abrahamic faiths, have a headline commandment: "Thou shalt not kill," and that's shared amongst all the Abrahamic faiths, and even outside of that, of course. But the politicians who are there, they try and twist and create justifications to undermine that very fundamental one of the Ten Commandments: "Thou shalt not kill." And actually, most people aren't that silly, really. They can see behind that quite easily.
And and I guess with so many, you know, with everybody sort of coming together, I mean, the protests were organised by Muslim Association of Britain, but also Stop the War as well, Coalition, things like that. You know, there were quite a few organisations involved in this protest. So that increased the numbers. Were you surprised that there were so many people there?
To be fair, I didn't. I'd say that the organisational sort of representation was far dwarfed by just people who had decided to come to show solidarity. In political rallies and things, you will see that many people are well organised, and they have all the same literature, and they have all the same sort of paraphernalia. But here it wasn't that. It was people were literally just coming because no one had told them to. They just heard of this rally, and they came, and they came with a very, very good temperament. They were very calm, and they were very clear about their message, that they stood against and they stand against this oppression. And that is it. In terms of organisations and their representation there, they were quite small in number, I'd say.
And with, obviously, the mainstream media, now they did actually put out that there were protests this weekend, but they are still using the word clashes, saying, well, we're protesting about the clashes in Gaza and Israel. And this is a little bit confusing, because people then are imagining that this is a balanced two-sided war. But this isn't helpful, is it? Because obviously we know for a start that the Palestinian people are being oppressed by the Israeli authorities. There is brutality. There is bloodshed going on. Their children have been killed at the hands of the Israeli authorities. Why are mainstream media not pointing that out? Why are they not stronger in saying what's going on? And why are they reluctant to report the truth, basically?
Well, I mean, it's amazing, really. We can go to look at think tanks around the world, Brookings, Chatham House and what have you, and they are all aflutter when it comes to, and quite properly, when it comes to Arab countries and their ethos towards journalists, for example, shutting down journalism, shutting down Twitter. The think tanks and the media are all aflutter about how awful that is. But they've been incredibly muted when it comes to Israel's bombing of the Associated Press building, with a very weak justification.
Al Jazeera building. Yeah, the Al Jazeera building was targeted, wasn't it?
It was a media tower, so it had Al Jazeera and it had Associated Press. Now, the idea that two massive multi-billion-pound organisations, whose job it is to do investigative journalism, were not aware, or if it were true, that there was a Hamas headquarters in the same building, is actually laughable. Mm-hmm. But the bigger point is that media has been very muted about the actual destruction of journalistic property and places, when they're very, very vocal when it comes to other countries who are not Israel, just being unfair in the way that they suppress journalism. That's just one example. If, for example, we looked at Crystal Nuts, what the Germans were doing appallingly towards their Jewish population in the 1940s, if someone described the Nazis, murdering and butchering Jewish people in Germany as clashes, that would quite properly be shocking, and it would be clearly messaging that was supportive of the Nazis.
Yeah, we do, and we we're getting messages as well about, obviously we want a de-escalation of what's going on, but when politicians use that word as well, that's also not helpful. It's like saying, well, can you imagine if we said to the Jews, in the Second World War, who were being killed, you have to work with the Nazis on this.
Yeah,
can you imagine us saying that? How that would have got you. It's just unbelievable.
Well, the whole thing becomes a nonsense when you take the language out of the current conflict and apply it to a very similar situation in any other scenario. So again, Nelson Mandela, South Africa, apartheid. If you said that was clashes, then it rubbishes the entire language, doesn't it? Really?
Mm.
So we know what it is, and that is part of the reason for the protest. We know that there's a great deal of influence that is wielded by the State of Israel within media, within politics. We've seen that by our own Home Secretary willing to be sacked, having lied about her activities in Israel to the previous Prime Minister. I mean, that is how far that type of influence goes. And populations recognise it, and populations now protesting against it.
And the suppression of voices goes on. I mean, even, it's quite shocking because people are saying that actually when they're putting out these messages on social media, that things are getting censored. Like, people are saying that if they mention the word Free Palestine, even the word Palestine, even if they're not saying anything, controversial whatsoever, they just mention the word Palestine, their messages are not reaching any other sort of, anybody else other than their own very small circle of friends. And I had this experience this morning as well. Myself, I put a message out and actually mentioned the word Palestine. There was nothing, wrong with what I said, and the message didn't move at all. And then when I said the same message again and then dubbed the word Palestine, I put, P-A-L and then star, the message went through. So, how can we get beyond this?
Well, this is digital apartheid or digital oppression, and these phrases are now being created to define the sort of unfair behavioural practices of these companies. However, the reality is that this has been a problem that's been highlighted by fake news and then super controlled by the companies that are mainly based out in the US. What we are seeing, though, is that with the rise of blockchain and cryptocurrencies, there will be developed social media platforms that are decentralized and much less subject to this sort of control. So, unfortunately, this event has happened at a time when social media companies have decided to stand as a sort of spokesperson or certainly a mouthpiece for the Israeli regime at the moment. But the technology is moving on, so that sort of control is unlikely to happen in the future. But right now, we should call it out for what it is, and demand to see the policies that allow them to do this.
I absolutely agree. Continue to call it out, and I guess continue with those protests now that they are making some noise. Will you be going on another protest soon, Tasneem?
Well, I'll certainly have a look at what's happening. There was a protest last night, right, with some vehicles that unfortunately there were rather nefarious elements there, calling out quite horrific things, and quite rightly were called out. But one of the very annoying things about that is unacceptable. But Boris Johnson managed to tweet about those comments very quickly. However, Boris Johnson was very muted and took many days to call out actual child murder. So apparently, name-calling is of a greater concern to Boris Johnson than the murder of children with rockets. Well,
that is definitely food for thought, Tasneem. This is part of the problem, as you said, sort of, the worry of suppression of Muslim voices. I think the Muslim community do worry about this, but they have managed to, so many of them over the Eid weekend, go on those protests and, raise those Palestinian flags, and inshallah will continue to, protest safely in the right way, without any anti-Semitic, chants or anything like that, because that obviously is going to ruin, the motion that is happening, is going to ruin the movement, which is happening right now and which is growing, and that is what we've got to, basically think about what is going on, why we are protesting as well, is to stop the oppression of Palestinians. It's for humanity, you know.
Well, I'd like to add as a strong message to anyone who wants to go to these protests that the playing field on this argument is very, very unlevel. It is not in your favour, not in our favour.
Mm-hmm.
So what we will see is if anyone steps out of line and does anything foolish or silly or even criminal, which is name-calling of a particular community, well, then the story becomes...
Taking over the epitome of culture